She screamed, but no one came. Her neighbors heard it. The priest passed by her door. Her own sister knew what was happening behind the wooden walls, but no one moved, because in the eyes of the law, she deserved it. She had spoken out once. Against her husband, against his fists, she'd whispered the word no. And for that, and forced her to kneel in the dirt while the villagers threw stones at her. They called it justice. Brutal truths behind justice. What happened to that woman wasn't an isolated cruelty. It was a system. A medieval machine of punishment designed not to bring order, but to break women. Across Europe, from the 11th to the 16th centuries, women were punished not just for crimes, but for existing outside the lines drawn by men. Lines like, don't speak too loudly, don't think too freely, don't desire too boldly, don't resist too publicly, were nothing short of terrifying. The Scold's bridle, silenced by steel, it looked like a torture device, and it was. The Scold's bridle, or brank, was first documented in Scotland in the 1500s, then spread to England and Germany. It was an iron muzzle, forged like a cage, fitted around a woman's head. Inside, a small metal plate pressed down on her tongue. If she spoke, it tore her mouth open. Its purpose, to punish scolds, a term for women who spoke too much, argued, or embarrassed men in public. Let that settle in. In 16th century England, a woman could be legally punished for talking too much. She'd be paraded through the streets in this contraption, a walking warning to every other woman. And this wasn't underground punishment. This was public, approved, and even praised. One record from Newcastle, 1567, states, "Greater than the bridle shall be clapped upon her head, and she shall be led through the market thrice, that others may take example." Women convicted of adultery or theft weren't just jailed. They were branded, a hot iron seared into their skin. Even after she served her sentence, her punishment walked with her for life. Everyone could see it and judge her. There's a chilling record from 1453 in Rouen, France. She spoke up, he walked free. The solution? The ducking stool. The goal wasn't death. The goal was shame. Crowds gathered, laughed, threw things. Even Queen Elizabeth I, in a 1600 royal decree, supported ducking stools as corrective instruments for wayward wives. A woman named Agnes Lemaire was dragged before the court by her husband. Her crime, refusing to return to his home after he publicly beat her in the market. The court sided with him. The judge's words were, recorded in the archives, "Greater than a woman's virtue lies not in resistance, but in obedience." Let this be a lesson to others. What lesson? That a man's pride was worth more than a woman's safety. The tongue-tearing, silenced by blood, rare but real. There are records, especially in Eastern Europe, of women having their tongues cut or pierced for blasphemy, heresy, or resisting the church. Instead, her punishment was designed to be poetic. The tongue that spoke was the tongue they silenced. She lived, but never spoke again. But to keep quiet, public whipping and shame walls in medieval Spain and parts of Germany, women convicted of theft or promiscuity could be chained to walls. In the village square, their crimes painted above them. They were forced to stand there for hours, often barefoot, partially undressed, or covered in mud, while people spat, jeered, and threw rotten food. Children were encouraged to mock them. Husbands were allowed to beat them once more before the punishment ended. In Cologne, 1310, a young girl of 16 was publicly whipped after being found with a local boy. He was let off with a warning. It was accidental. None of this was rare. These punishments were not isolated outbursts of violence. They were legal, systematic, and accepted. The church sanctioned them. Kings ignored them. Town leaders organized them. In places like Paris in the 1300s, York in the 1400s, Bologna in the 1500s, their pain was real, their stories erased. She was 9 years old when they sold her. No voice, no choice, just a father in debt and a nobleman with gold. She cried, but not for help. She already knew that no one would listen. In her world, a girl was not a daughter. She was a debt, a bride, a bargain. And when she bled on the wedding night, it was seen as proof of purity. When she screamed in pain, it was dismissed as a woman's natural burden. In medieval Europe, girls like her weren't rare. They were everywhere. Their pain was routine. Their suffering was custom. And no one called it a crime. Asterisk, child brides. Legalized suffering. In 13th century England, the age of consent for marriage was just 12 years old. In France, it was even lower, as young as 7, if the girl had reached puberty, but legality didn't mean safety. These girls were married off before they could read, before they could speak freely, before they even understood what marriage meant. One record from 1258, Normandy, describes the marriage of Isabelle de Fournier, age 10, to a 42-year-old knight who had just lost his third wife. She was wed in the village square, dressed in white linen. She couldn't sign her name on the marriage document. She didn't know how. 3 months later, she died in childbirth. Her death wasn't registered as tragic. It was simply noted. As unsuccessful betting, no one was punished, because to them, no crime had been committed. Asterisk nunnery as prison. Not every girl was sold into marriage. Some were locked away in a different kind of prison, the convent. In 15th century Italy, noble families often forced daughters into nunneries, not for spiritual reasons, but for financial convenience. Dowries were expensive, monasteries were cheaper. A daughter who questioned her fate was deemed rebellious or worse, sinful. In Florence, 1484, a girl named Lucia Rinaldi was placed in a convent at age 13 after she refused to marry a local merchant. She begged her parents to reconsider. They sent a priest to convince her. When she still refused, they signed her into the convent for life. Lucia spent 37 years behind stone walls, never kissed, never loved, never free. Her crime, wanting a different life. Asterisk witch trials, fire as a sentence. Perhaps no punishment was more horrifying or more widespread than those given to women accused of witchcraft. In medieval and early Renaissance Europe, thousands of women were hunted, tortured, and burned alive, not for casting spells, but for simply existing outside the rules. They were midwives, healers, widows, poor women, outspoken wives, and that was enough. In Germany alone, between 1450 and 1750, an estimated 25,000 women were executed as witches. One of them was Maria Holl, a respected innkeeper in Terdlingen, Germany. In 1593, she was accused of sorcery after a local man fell ill. She was tortured 56 times. She never confessed, but she was still jailed for life, her body broken, her voice silenced, her name erased from town records. Asterisk punished for healing. Before modern medicine, it was women who knew how to heal with herbs, salves, and centuries-old knowledge passed down from mother to daughter. But in the 14th and 15th centuries, that knowledge became dangerous. If a woman cured an illness that priests could not, she was accused of using dark magic. If she treated a wound with herbs instead of holy prayer, she was labeled unholy. In 1487, the infamous witch-hunting Manual Malleus Maleficarum was published. Written by Heinrich Kramer, it declared, "When a woman thinks alone, she thinks evil." The book claimed women were more likely to become witches because they were weaker in faith and more carnal, and thus the healing hands that once saved lives became the hands they chained. Asterisk death by drowning. One of the cruelest punishments for accused women was the witch's trial by water. The logic was twisted. If a woman floated, she was a witch and had to be executed. If she sank, she was innocent, but often drowned anyway. In Salem, England, and parts of Germany, these tests were public entertainment. Crowds gathered by the river, women were tied and thrown in, children laughed, priests watched. In 1611, in Essex, a woman named Joan Flower was drowned for allegedly cursing a lord's son with a fever. No evidence, no trial, just a fear-soaked crowd and a body that never surfaced. Asterisk whipped for adultery, even if it wasn't her fault. In many medieval societies, adultery by a woman was a offense, even when there was no proof or if she had been assaulted. In 1456, in Castile, Spain, a woman named Elena was accused of infidelity after her husband returned from war and found her with a child. She wept, saying she had been attacked by a neighbor months earlier. No one believed her. The court ordered her to be whipped naked through the streets. The attacker never questioned. This was a common theme across regions, from Aragon to Naples, from Wales to Bohemia. A man's word weighed more than a woman's wounds. Asterisk the shame parade. Public humiliation was not just a punishment, it was a ritual. Women convicted of gossip, disobedience, or minor theft were paraded half-dressed through towns. Their hair was shaved, their heads tarred, their names screamed in mockery. Children threw mud. Priests sprinkled holy water. In Paris, 1309, a mother of 5 was made to march barefoot through the city with a sign that read, "She forgot her place," all because she had spoken against a tax collector who overcharged her family. Moral courts and street justice. By the 15th century, moral courts had sprung up in cities across Europe, small, church-led tribunals where women were often tried for dressing provocatively, not attending church, gossiping, acting above their station. The punishments were swift and vicious: stocks and pillories, public slapping ceremonies where officials would literally slap the woman before a crowd, forced fasting or isolation for weeks. In Ghent, Bruges, and Vienna, these courts became places where reputation could be destroyed overnight, and the accused, mostly poor women, mostly voiceless, mostly forgotten. She wore silk, she had servants, she walked through marble halls, but she wasn't free, because even queens bled in silence. Even noblewomen were punished, not with chains of iron, but with chains of expectation, humiliation, and quiet suffering. Her crown didn't protect her. It only made her pain invisible. In medieval Europe, no woman was safe, not in the palace, not in the church, not in her own home. And those who dared to fight back, history remembers them as rebels, but in their time, they were punished as traitors behind the walls of power. Noble women under control. We imagine royalty as luxury, but for many medieval noblewomen, life behind stone castle walls was a cage lined with gold. Marriage was not a choice. It was a contract, and if she broke it, even to protect herself, the punishment could be as brutal as it was discreet. Take Eleanor of Aquitaine, one of the most powerful women in 12th century Europe. She ruled lands, led armies, and was married to King Henry II of England. But when she began to assert her own political voice, Henry had her imprisoned for 16 years. No trial, no formal charges, just silence. And she was a queen. Now imagine what they did to women without titles. The case of Joan of Kent, too many marriages. In 14th century England, Joan of Kent, mother of the future king, Richard II, was nearly executed for being married to 2 men. Though unknowingly, her first husband left, presumed dead in war. She remarried, but when the first returned, her second marriage was condemned. She was dragged to court, shamed publicly, and nearly imprisoned for immoral conduct. The king stepped in, not out of mercy, but to protect royal reputation. Her fate was spared, but her name was tarnished for life. She hadn't lied. She hadn't cheated. She'd just survived, and that, apparently, was too much. Silent torture in religious life. Inside convents, silence was not peace, it was punishment. While many women entered by force, others sought refuge, hoping for a life of learning or service. But once inside, even small disobedience could result in horrifying consequences. In 15th century Germany, records show that nuns who spoke during silent hours or refused to perform harsh penance were locked in punishment cells, denied food for days, forced to sleep on cold stone floors without blankets. In some cases, their tongues were burned with heated iron rods for speaking unholy words. In Prague, 1492, Sister Katerina was sealed into a tiny cell for writing letters to her family without permission. She died of starvation 3 weeks later. The church called it a holy death. Rebellion had a price. The woman who spoke. Not all women were quiet. Some, against every warning, every threat, spoke out. One of them was Marguerite Porete, a French mystic and philosopher in the 13th century. She wrote a book challenging the Church's view of women's souls, saying that women could reach God without male priests. For that, she was arrested. By the Inquisition, she refused to recant. In 1310, she was burned alive in Paris before a silent crowd. She said nothing as the flames took her, not because she was afraid, but because she had already said everything she needed to. Her book was banned, her name was erased from church history. But centuries later, her words were found again, and translated into hundreds of languages. They tried to burn her voice. Instead, they spread it punishment for power. Women who led in rare moments. Women rose to real power as rulers, generals, defenders of their people. But the price was high. In 15th century France, Joan of Arc, a teenage girl, claiming visions from God, led armies to victory during the 100 Years' War. She was captured, handed to the English, and put on trial for heresy. The real reason? She dressed like a man, she led like a king. She refused to bow to the church, and for that she was burned at the stake in 1431, at just 19 years old. Her ashes were thrown into the river, so no one could worship her grave. But the river carried her story far beyond what her enemies ever imagined. Asterisk, no voice, no body, no justice. In countless small villages, in what is now Poland, Ireland, Spain, Turkey, women were punished not for what they did, but for what they represented: power, emotion, wisdom, desire. Anything that made them more than obedient was branded dangerous. And if a woman disappeared from the record books or was buried without a name, that was no mistake. It was the system working exactly as intended. Asterisk, the final story. The unknown girl. Her name was never written down, not in a court record, not in a church book, not even on her grave. But we know her. She was born into silence, taught to fear, taught to serve, taught to kneel. She may have whispered back once, or tried to run, or simply existed too loudly. And one day she was punished. She may have been shackled, or branded, or buried in a field no one remembers. But her story lives in all the others. In the hands that reached for help, in the mouths that dared to speak, in the bones that never healed. She is not gone. She is here. In every woman who says, "I won't," be silent. Asterisk, conclusion, let the silence break. These stories aren't fairy tales. They aren't ancient myths. They are the real history of women, carved into stone, stained into parchment, buried in the dirt of forgotten towns. They are stories of pain, but also of strength, because even under fire, under chains, under centuries of silence, women endured. They remembered, they whispered, they survived. And now we speak for them, not out of pity, but out of power, because the most brutal punishment is being forgotten, and we won't let that happen. Not anymore.